Good evening. If I could have your attention and if everyone could be seated, we'll get this wonderful program going. Thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Jim Karam. I'm the chairman of the board of the Edward M. Kennedy Institute and have the privilege of honor of leading this institute's board of directors. Since opening of the institute, part of our mission has been a strong focus on enhancing and educating the public, especially our youth, on the process and importance of civic engagement. In that process, we have hosted an incredible group of speakers and thought leaders from civil rights leader Congressman John Lewis, who spent an afternoon talking about voting rights with the Boston Public School students, to Pulitzer Prize-winning author Junot Diaz, to Red Sox Hall of Famer Pedro Martinez. Senator Elizabeth Warren gave a powerful speech in support of Black Lives Movement here last September, and elected leaders of both parties have come together to speak about bipartisan efforts to move legislation forward on criminal justice reform, combating opiate epidemic, and responding to refugees seeking new homes in America. These programs would not have been possible without the support of grants like the one from the Republic of Ireland that have brought this evening possible, made it possible. And I want to thank the Irish Consulate in Boston and the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for Conflict Intervention at Maynooth University for making this evening and so many of our events possible. We aim with every program to provide a platform for robust dialogue and debate on important issues and policy movements in our history, and tonight's discussion is no exception. With this grant, the Institute has been able to provide substantive conversation surrounding the centennial and surrounding the Irish centennial and celebrate the United States' relationship with Ireland that was so important to Senator Kennedy, who valued it so deeply. We have a great panel discussion ahead of us this evening, but before we dive into the program, it is my honor to introduce our next speaker for the evening. Finola Quinlan has been serving as Consul General of Ireland since September of last year. She represents the Irish government in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Maine, Vermont, and Rhode Island, where through her work, she has helped to renew the cultural and political ties binding Ireland and New England, and has strengthened the Irish community throughout the region. She has been an indispensable partner throughout the creation of this evening's program, and I am honored to ask her to come forward for some remarks and to welcome her tonight. Finola Quinlan.
Mrs. Kennedy, President Murray, Mr. Ahern, Reverend Mason, Mr. Karam, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your very warm welcome. We're honoured to be joined by so many of you this evening as we reflect on the centenary of the Easter Rising and our journey since. The Government of Ireland has been determined to ensure that the commemorations of 2016 belong to everyone on our island, irrespective of political or family background. The decade of centenaries is not only about remembering the past, but seeking to reconcile and to respect all traditions. Commemorations, of course, are also about the present and the future as we look forward. They serve as a mirror reflecting who we are, but also challenge us to consider the legacy we want to leave for the next 100 years. And it's certainly true that the commemorations this year have opened up space for conversations that didn't take place for a century. Throughout the year, we've heard different perspectives and debated contrasting views, all in an atmosphere of respect. And this is fitting when you consider that the signatories of the 1916 proclamation crafted a document which aspired to cherish all of the children of the nation equally, reflecting their desire for an inclusive republic and their vision of a diverse Irish identity. Ireland in 1916 was, as it is now, a global island, a nation that was engaged in the international issues of the day. Naturally, the events of 1916 are viewed against the backdrop of the broader nationalist movement, but also they must be seen in the context of the determination of unionist communities to prevent any weakening of the link with the Crown, and of course through the lens of the brutal and tragic First World War. Men from all over the island fought and died in that devastating conflict, and those who fought, Unionists and Nationalists, were there for different and often contrasting reasons, but their experiences were shared, as was the grief of their bereaved families. So it's deeply fitting that we remember the events of 100 years ago in all of their complexity, that we honour those who died on all sides and on none. Earlier this year, the government joined in commemorating the Battle of the Somme, in which so many men from North and South died. And recently, our Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade, Charlie Flanagan, spoke at a deeply symbolic ceremony to commemorate the British soldiers killed in the Rising. And I think his words will resonate with us this evening. He said, "Those of us participating in today's event are a diverse group of individuals with different backgrounds, beliefs and aspirations. Such differences do not divide us, and they need not hinder us from coming together to reflect upon the moments that have shaped the history of our island. In the century since the events of 1916, we have learned through painful experience the importance of mutual respect for the different traditions across these islands." And where more appropriate to continue this discussion than tonight in the Edward M. Kennedy Institute with our panel of esteemed speakers. So, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Mrs. Victoria Kennedy. It is a particular honour to do so here in the Institute, established in honour of her late husband, Senator Ted Kennedy, a great friend and an advocate for Ireland, who did so much to foster reconciliation and peace. Mrs. Kennedy has carried on much of that important work. She remains deeply committed to Ireland, most recently chairing a panel discussion on the peace process at the EMKI in Washington. She was at Vice President Biden's breakfast for the Taoiseach. But of course, many of you will know Mrs. Kennedy as an advocate for issues affecting women, children and families, including healthcare, education and civic engagement. She does all of that and so much more. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome me in giving a warm welcome to Mrs. Kennedy.
Thank you, Consul General Fionnuala, for that very warm introduction and for being such a wonderful representative for Ireland here in New England. We are so grateful to you, to Ambassador Anne Anderson, to Taoiseach Enda Kenny, and to the people of Ireland for the support you've given to the Kennedy Institute here in Boston for this celebration of the centenary of the 1916 Easter Rising. Thanks to you, along with the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for Conflict Intervention at Maynooth University in Ireland, we're able to have this discussion, to discuss 100 years of freedom, Ireland, then and now. And we're so thrilled to be joined in this discussion by such an illustrious panel. The man I'll introduce in a moment, former Taoiseach Bertie Ahern, Reverend Dr. Gary Mason, our own former Senate President, the Honorable Therese Murray, Professor Robert Savage, and of course our moderator, columnist Kevin Cullen. The collaboration on the topic of Ireland between the Edward M. Kennedy Institute here in Boston and the Edward M. Kennedy Institute at Maynooth seems quite fitting to me, because Edward M. Kennedy himself was both a student of and a key player in the history of Ireland. Just this past May, as you've heard, we hosted a lively program in Washington on Ireland and the peace process, as recounted by various participants in the Edward M. Kennedy Oral History Project. You can find those oral histories and a tape of the program we did in Ireland on our website at emkinstitute.org. I really encourage you to take a look at it because it's very interesting. Our discussion then, as now, was held against the backdrop of the commemoration of the centenary of the Easter Rising, the first step in the process that led to the independence of the Republic of Ireland. But as we all know, even after that independence, the North and South remained divided, and there was unrest. And for the Irish diaspora here in the United States, there remained deep concern for what was happening in the land of their ancestors. Shortly after the Troubles began in the late 1960s, my husband began to immerse himself more deeply in the issue and to focus very deeply on the possibilities for peace and reconciliation in Northern Ireland. To raise consciousness and help end violence, he joined with another giant from Massachusetts, Speaker Tip O'Neill, as well as with New York Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan and New York Governor Hugh Carey. They called them the Four Horsemen. But peace didn't happen overnight, and it took a lot of good people working together over a lot of years. And one of the indispensable figures in that process is our next speaker. To look at his career is to look at the career of a public servant and a leader. A native of Dublin, he was first elected to the Irish Parliament to represent his district in 1977 as a member of the Fianna Fáil party. After holding national ministerial positions in several administrations, he was Minister of Labor, Minister of Finance, even Deputy Prime Minister, I believe, for a while. He was elected Taoiseach, or Prime Minister, in 1997 at the age of 45. Elected to serve for 2 more consecutive terms, he became Ireland's second longest serving Prime Minister. Teddy worked closely with him when he was Taoiseach, and I was lucky enough to be a fly on the wall during a lot of those meetings. Everyone who knows our next speaker will agree that he was single-minded in his quest for peace and reconciliation in Northern Ireland. Early in his first term as Taoiseach, he negotiated with British Prime Minister Tony Blair and leaders of political parties in Northern Ireland to end the Troubles. Their landmark agreement, signed on Good Friday of 1998, laid the groundwork for peace and shared governance. And his work didn't end there. As one observer put it, he has endless levels of energy and dedication, and he does big, bold, difficult things, and he does them well. I personally would like to add that he's a very gracious host and lots of fun. So without further ado, please give a big Boston welcome to the former Taoiseach of the Republic of Ireland, Bertie Ahern.
Thanks very much, Vicky, and it is such an honour and a pleasure to be here with you, Vicky Kennedy, at the Edward M. Kennedy Institute of the United States Senate, and can I congratulate you and everybody who has worked with you and assisted you in bringing this to full fruition. It is a wonderful, wonderful place, and I know and have read many times about the effort and the work and the organisation and commitment to fulfil Ted's dreams and to bring them to reality, and I know how hard you worked, so well done, and it's a great honour to be here with you. To all of the people that are here this evening, can I thank you for coming. I think you're going to have to listen to a few speeches, sorry about that, but I hope you do find them useful. I want to thank Fionnuala Quinlan, our Consul General, for the arrangements and for all our help and assistance. And I want to thank those that have come here with me from Ireland, Kieran Dial and Peter Cassells from the Institute and Kennedy Institute in Maynooth. Thank you, Vicky, for what you've said. I'm delighted to be involved in that, in conflict resolution in a lot of areas. Not going to talk too much about that tonight, but it does great work, terrific work, and we thank you for allowing us to have it after and call it after a great man. I was lucky enough to work with Ted from 83 to 2008. He was always a huge help, always a huge guidance, always available to us. I remember when I came back to Dublin after the Good Friday Agreement, it was obviously a long week for me, and a tiring week, and the first person that rang me when I got back was Teddy. Always remembered that conversation, and he was always there for us whenever we wanted him, and that was a lot. And whether it was St. Patrick's Day or any other visit, he did so much for us, and it's for that reason it's so nice to be here. I kind of feel that office. I was in it about 100 times outside. It's great to see it reconstructed. I'm privileged, as my colleagues that are here, to be invited guest, and obviously proud to be an Irishman, to be here to share some of the story of Irish history with you. I come here to share with you my experience of peace through inclusive dialogue and to cover some of the centenary period. And I hope to go through in some detail our history, but trying to move it fairly quickly. That's got us where we are 100 years on. Obviously, people ask me many places what was my proudest achievement, but I think just to be involved in the opportunity to make a contribution to the creation of what we all pray will be a lasting peace in our country. And that's been the greatest privilege of my life, and it's also a great lesson in just for conflict resolution in other parts of the world. We all love our homelands. I know how much you love this this area, and we all think there's no place like it on earth, and in my case, Ireland. I'm happy simply to be right about that. I know that Ireland is a place which has been blessed by enormous natural beauty, sea and beautiful cities and towns, led by the most beautifulest place in Ireland, Dublin, and not even bad footballers. But transcending all of that are our people, a people that have given the world over the centuries such luminaries as James Joyce and George Bernard Shaw, Samuel Beckett, Oscar Wilde, and that's just our writers. And there's a wonderful publication by an Irish-American writer, Thomas Cahill, as we call him, called Cahill, called How the Irish Saved Civilization. And the title of that, which alone tells you all you need to know in terms of the general point that I'm making. But seriously, I think that's a fine work, and I commend it to you all. But despite, ladies and gentlemen, all our amazing features in terms of land and people, the history of our beautiful island has been one of war and bloodshed and conflict and division, hatred, famine, immigration. And if that is our history, much of the reason for it had to do with our geography. We're a small island, hugely strategically located, beside a much larger island in the edge of the great continent of Europe and pointing across the mighty Atlantic, which gives us all the sunshine, to the new world of the United States of America. Now you can relax, Vicky. I'm not going to give the 900 years of Irish history, but I definitely won't do that. But suffice it is to say that the interaction between our neighbouring island of Britain and ourselves, with occasional incursions from continental brethren such as the Vikings and the Norse, has led us to a canvas that has been complex, that's been multi-layered, and sadly for too long was stained by bloodshed and conflict. We're going through that period, as Fionnuala said, of the centenaries, and thankfully it's been really an interesting period. It really is covering 1913 to 23. That's looking at the Home Rule Bill, the Ulster Covenants, the Ulster Volunteers, the Irish Volunteers, Cumann na mBan, which was the ladies' movement, the Labour lockout of 1913, the bitter struggles of employers against trade unionists, the First World War, 1914 to 1918, which saw tens of thousands of Irish people, north and south, killed. The rising itself of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the involvement of the volunteers and the Citizen Army, the first Dáil of 1919, which will come up in a few years' time, the treaty, the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921, which was responsible for the Civil War, depending which way you look at it, but caused the Civil War. So all of that period in our history comes together in this decade. And what we're doing is commemorating it, celebrating it, living it, but as Fionnuala said, in an inclusive way. We were trying hard, I think, not to leave anybody out, and trying to look on it as it should be looked on 100 years back, and to debate it in that context. I'm going to move away from 1916 fastly to 1920s, the division of the island in two, with the south, the state where I come from, gaining its independence, the northeast of the island, today's Northern Ireland, remaining as it still does part of the United Kingdom. And the new configuration did not resolve, as Vicky said, the legacy of history. Effectively, the two parts of the island evolved in very different directions. The south, beset at the onset of a civil war, set about the task of building itself into a viable, independent state. It took several decades, as many of you know, for that process to be complete. And in the meantime, and in parallel, the North experienced a very different trajectory. Tensions between the majority community, the largely Protestant and supportive of the Union and Britain, and the minority community, largely Catholic and supportive of a united Ireland, remained high throughout the decades. And the political reality was that the power and influence rested largely with the Unionist community, with the Catholic nationalist community having a strong sense of being discriminated against in their own land, while also feeling cut off from the new state in the south. And over those decades between 1920 and the late 60s, the two jurisdictions of the island had very little to do with each other. And despite being close neighbours on the small island, there was little cooperation between the two administrations. Only about 3 meetings in that whole period between political leaders. And on the contrary, relations between Dublin and Belfast were tense, they were hostile. And if this was bad, matters were to become directly worse in the late 60s. The old enemies of history, which had remained bottled up and packed down in the decades since partition, they suddenly exploded to the surface again. Northern Ireland, as we know, was the cockpit, but the ripples affected the whole island. And the catalyst was the arrival of the civil rights movement on the north, echoing what was happening in parts of Europe and the United States. People took to the streets of Belfast demanding civil rights for Catholics and the end to the discrimination. And the authorities of the north reacted in strong fashion, deploying riot police seeking to prevent the marches by force. Intercommunal tensions between Catholic and Protestant escalated rapidly and alarmingly. And for the purpose of my remarks tonight, I'm telescoping dramatically. But suffice to say that by 1970, a large-scale conflict was underway in Northern Ireland, subsequently to be known euphemistically as the Troubles, and which was to last a whole long and bitter generation. Over 3,000 people died in those Troubles. Tens of thousands of people were injured. Reverend Gary Mason said that today, if he put a figure to me in US terms, it would be something like 800,000 people that would have been killed in that period. Thousands more were injured and maimed. The theatre of conflict was populated by paramilitary organisations, the IRA, the INLA, the UDA, the UVF, the Red Hand Commandos. And on the state side, the British Army was deployed on the streets of the north for the first time in decades, and serving beside local law enforcement organisations, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the Ulster Defence Regiment. And while many Catholics, ladies and gentlemen, and nationalists condemned the campaign of violence of the IRA, there were deep tensions between the security forces and the broader Catholic nationalist community. Protestant paramilitary groups such as the UDA and the UVF carried out horrendous sectarian attacks on Catholic victims, often chosen at random. And for their part, many Unionists felt besieged by the organisation of the IRA, which they regarded as ruthless terrorists who had, in their view, the tacit support, at least of the Catholic or some of the Catholic community. And when much of the activity of conflict took place in the north, of course the south also was greatly affected, with some horrific incidents and loss of life. All of these for 25 years or so, between the late 60s and the 90s, were a nightmare of awful proportions for Ireland, and has us in the global, or had us in the global headlines for all of that period for the wrong reasons. At the same time, it would be wrong to say that there was no progress. The British and Irish government started to work more closely together from the 80s. Teddy was involved in much of those efforts, Vicky, as you know well. Then there was the Anglo-Irish Agreement in '85. There were the statements from here by the Four Horsemen on St. Patrick's Day. There was the dialogue to put pressure on people to try to come to the negotiating table. The Republican movement, there was beginning to be a reassessment of the objectives, which had, with careful encouragement from the two governments, to the IRA ceasefire in 1994. But it proved impossible to get meaningful negotiation underway. That ceasefire broke down. However, thanks to tireless work by successive governments and officials on both sides, by political leaders, by many religious leaders of all denominations, by John Hume, who put a lot of huge efforts in at that time, who was very close to Teddy, there were some progress made. So, ladies and gentlemen, that was the situation which I came into as Taoiseach, as Prime Minister, in the summer of '97. Coincidentally, as it turned out, very importantly, Tony Blair became Prime Minister of Britain around the same time. We had worked in opposition together. We got on well. We both agreed that addressing the Northern Ireland situation was a top priority for both of us. We were conscious how difficult the task was going to be, but there were a lot of good people, a lot of good officials and a lot of good people there to work with us. By the way, I take the opportunity, as I always do, to pay tribute to Tony Blair for the immense contribution that he made to the peace process in Ireland. I'm sure that history will record that contribution in a very positive way. And while, like all of us in politics, he gets into arguments about other places, I'll only talk about the conflict I was involved in with him, and he gave huge time and effort to Ireland. Again, I'm telescoping here, but in that '97 period, over 12 months, for the first meeting in the summer of '97, we engaged in a deeply intensive process of talks around the conflict. That also involved the political parties in Northern Ireland. Very crucially, the talks process itself was chaired by somebody from beyond our shores and the two islands, the legendary Senator George Mitchell, aided by others from Canada and Finland, which were hugely helpful to us. And then President Clinton, who again played a key role for us in late '97 and right through '98. The aim of the talks, which is where we really are today, and I think it's why we reflect where, as we move through this centenary, was a comprehensive agreement which addressed a range of issues at the heart of the conflict, and to which the British and Irish governments and the main political parties in Northern Ireland could sign up to. It was a hugely tall order, given the lessons of our history, and it certainly hadn't been achieved before. But with good American pragmatism, George Mitchell set a deadline for April 9th for the talks, which took place in Belfast and Castle Buildings. The prospects for success, I think, as many of you know here, were not good. The opinion poll the previous week was that success was about 5% possible. So don't take too much notice of opinion polls, regardless of what side you're on. But looking back on it, that year was one of the most intensive of my life. I think we literally put in hundreds of hours in face-to-face negotiations, phone calls, consultations, and many times it looked as if matters, as always happens in conflict, that they would break down. We had crises big and small. We had nervous people who had never met before, even though they lived in a relatively small city. They never had any real dialogue. And we were, I think, lucky to have people like the Reverend Gary Mason here, who was prepared to work and try and get us contacts with political leaders on the loyalist side, unionist side, to try to get us to talk with people that we'd never dealt with. I ended up dealing, as I had to, with Mr. Trimble. I had no knowledge of him. He, I don't think, probably liked Taoiseachs from the south. my interest and his interest didn't exactly coincide. He was into opera. I knew nothing about it. Obviously, he knew nothing about Gaelic football. And if he was bad enough, then I had to move to Reverend Paisley. Both of them ended up great friends. Reverend Dr. Paisley and I, the late Dr. Paisley. I dealt with him for 10 years in the talks process. He refused to shake hands to me for 9 of them, which I wasn't too upset about. But we ended up remarkably close, and his family, and I remain very close to them now. So against all the odds, and to the surprise and the shock of many, we did achieve success in that afternoon of the 10th of April, a day which, thankfully, in the case, not a dollar short agreement was reached. And that day is what we hoped was a good omen, happened to be Good Friday and also the eve of the Jewish Passover. So the document came to be known as the Good Friday Agreement in some places and the Belfast Agreement in others, but that's because we never agree with anything. But anyway, because Gary is here, I'll say Belfast Agreement, but I have a problem with it. But anyway, I'll tell you that story some other time. I think weeks later we had the referendum, and the people of the North voted by a good majority, and the people of the South by a huge majority. The reason for the vote, we were talking about this today, there was an argument that in 1918, when there was an election, it was the last election of the whole island. And of course, after that, there was never an election of the whole island because we went our separate ways. So the reason the Good Friday Agreement was put to the people, North and South, was to rescind that argument. I don't think it was a fact, but it was to rescind the argument and to end that argument for all times. I'm sure many people here are familiar with the terms of the Good Friday Agreement, or you've heard it and read it many times, so I just want to be very brief about it. But in broad terms, what it did, and this is where we are today, and it hasn't changed in an iota since, it constitutes the shared view of the British and Irish government, the northern parties, and indeed the people of the island of Ireland as a whole, in how relations are to be configured from that day and on into the future. Within Northern Ireland, between North and South, and between the island of Ireland and between Ireland and Britain. There are constitution provisions to give effect to constitutional change, essentially enshrining the principle of consent for the people of Northern Ireland as to whether the North is to remain part of the UK or join the United Ireland. It has institution provisions for partnership structures of government in Northern Ireland to capture cooperative arrangements between North and South and between Ireland and Britain. It has provisions in regard to diverse matters such as policing, which has now been fully implemented, the administration of justice, victims of violence, which still remains a problem, economic and social and cultural issues, human rights, decommissioning of arms, prisoners associated with the conflict, which are all now dealt with. And very crucially, it had provisions for the agreement to be put to the people, and as I said, that did happen. George Mitchell often said that implementation would be more challenging than negotiation, and as always, he was right. We negotiated it in April of '98, and we didn't complete the negotiations till 2007. And over that period, the institutions agreement were suspended many times. It was more stop than go. The issues like decommission of IRA and other groups, weapons, the transition of a new civilian police force, genuine cross-community support and participation, as well as technically complex and emotive issues. And we had to draw on how the two communities in Northern Ireland interpreted the events of the previous 30 years and with attitudes to the legitimacies and power of the state. Negotiations, of course, on all these issues were torturous and seemingly endless. And it always seemed that as we solved the problems on one side, we created the problems on the other. And an underlying difficulty remained that the majority unionist community remained profoundly divided over the very fundamentals of the agreement, and enduring the ups and downs of negotiation required enormous patience and stamina. But I must say that Tony Blair, regardless of other difficulties, stuck with that, and that's why I was so grateful. And we did get there. We had to amend the agreements to bring in the Democratic Unionist Party, Dr. Paisley's party, then Mr. Robinson's party, and then Arlen Foster's, now of the three leaders, in the St Andrews Agreement of 2006, to bring it right up to date. As we meet here tonight, I think we have a Northern Ireland that is very much at peace. We have representatives of the two major traditions working constructively in partnership, executive in the north. They've projects for cooperation that have been taken forward. The Irish government are involved very actively in North-South and the North-South Ministerial Council. Excellent work taking place in a range of areas every week. The creation of an island economy. And we have unprecedented cooperation between the Irish and British government, which we never had in our history. And I think that is good. I'm not going to talk about Brexit tonight, because I don't know what's going to happen. And if the British government don't know, how the hell would I know? So the blocked energy that has been released by this new positive dispensation is wonderful. And I think communities who were once old enemies are working together. Everything isn't perfect, but there's good partnership, there's good neighbourness. And Northern Ireland, I think, is doing a good job in business and commerce as well, and employment. And I think it is fair to say that the South of Ireland helped them in every turn around the world on that. There is that sense of hope that is there, and I think the political leaders in the north, now they argue about education and welfare and health. It's not about violence, it's not about the conflict, the troubles. They're genuinely involved with things that the people are now engaged with, and that is always great to see. So I should say that I just want to say a few words about conflicts generally, because with the Kennedy Institute for Conflict Resolution, we try to take some of the examples that Teddy worked with us and try to use them elsewhere to try and give the lesson. And there are people come from many parts of the world. We've had involvements with nearly all of the modern day conflicts, from Colombia, from Turkey, from Cyprus, and people come to see what happened. Of course, the first line I always say is that there are no two conflict situations that are the same. Each has its own unique character, its own unique features. And I do believe that there are some elements of our situation in Ireland which can be drawn into developing conflict resolution elsewhere. I believe there has to be a broad acceptance by the parties involved, that people involved in a conflict, that the status quo is untenable. If people believe that the status quo is fine, then people like me should go do something else, because you're wasting your time. If people think that it's fine to just continue on bombing, killing, shooting, you can do very little about it except work in the background and hope that on another day it will happen. My colleagues spend a lot of time in the Middle East, talking to people in groups, and it is on the basis that someday, some way, there will be an opportunity to make progress. I think another key lesson is the need to be as inclusive and comprehensive as possible in terms of the parties to negotiations. I do accept that it is a sensitive issue in terms of who sovereign governments sit down and negotiate with. You're always asked that question around the world. Is it all right for a sovereign government to sit down with somebody who's been engaged in what is considered illegal killing and war? But there cannot be a sense that it's impossible to bomb oneself to a negotiating table. No government can allow that, nor do I suggest it. But certainly in our case, we insisted that no party that was involved in violence, directly or indirectly, could be part of the process. So our inclusivity was not unconditional. And it was not just a basic moral principle, but a matter of practical politics in terms of participation of others. But on the other hand, if those who are involved in the conflict are not party to the negotiations, they will not feel themselves bound by the outcome. And as Yitzhak Rabin said, you make peace with your enemies, not your friends. In our case, Tony Blair and I opted for an inclusive process. We took chances with the majority of the parties, including those associated with paramilitary groups around the table. That was complex, it was difficult, but in our context and situation, I think it proved in time the right decision, but it is risky. I feel that a key decision, but one that has to be taken by those closely involved in terms of each negotiation. You can't have a broad brush and say that's what you should do here or there. Those involved have to make that call. A further lesson is comprehensiveness in terms of issues. I think the reason that the Good Friday Agreement, the Belfast Agreement, has worked is that we could have taken a smaller amount of issues and that would have been easier to deal with. But by taking all of the major issues, that has, I think, led it to make a far easier landing and has made it easier to keep on top of it. And I suppose another key requirement, and this is a personal one, is to seek to put yourself in the shoes of the other person in negotiations. If a person is involved in negotiations and they lecture the other side, if they tell them what they should believe in, and if they tell them what they should feel, you're never going to solve it. You have to listen, you have to try and debate, you have to try and understand. And that means that there has to be some knowledge about what are the difficulties are, and they were kind of the arguments that I had with people like Dr. Paisley and Mr. Trimble. I mean, Dr. Paisley, he had a good sense of humour, though it took me 8 years to realise that. But he did accuse me once of meeting in the Irish Embassy in London. We spent 3 months trying to arrange out where we'd meet, and we went from I'd meet him in the middle of a field, or I'd meet him in Belfast, or I'd meet him in London, or meet him anywhere. So in the end, he made a huge compromise and said we'd meet in the Irish Embassy. And he came in, he said his prayers, and I joined him in as best I could. And we had breakfast, just the two of us across the table. First time to really, I had met him before as a religious leader, but first time to meet him as a political leader to start the negotiations. And we had, courtesy of the embassy, you always know that in embassies and consuls they give you very good breakfasts. So we had a really good breakfast, and all. But then when he went outside to the press conference, he said that the reason he'd hard-boiled eggs was because I would have tried to poison the eggs. Of course, when I went out, I went out later on, and I said, well, he should have checked the orange juice. But he was a good character, and in the end, he was very successful. The last point I want to make is just the involvement of external players, and it's a key question. In our case, there's no doubt that the contribution of the European Union and the United States helped us so much. You had to try and internationalise it. You had to try and make it a bigger question. And you needed as well people who understood it. And that's what brings me here to say on this day, just the huge commitment that Teddy Kennedy made to our process, because he stuck with it for years. It's easy to come and go. People have lots of other things to do, particularly if you're trying to pass 300 bits of legislation in your lifetime. But he stuck with it, and his understanding, and he knew the personalities. And he was able to say the tough things when they needed to be said. And that meant falling out with people at times and taking tough measures. But he stuck with it right through. And Vicky, you were there together in May 2007 when we saw it through. And I know what that meant to him, what it meant to all of us. But he'd been through for so many decades. So we appreciate that. We appreciate what Bill Clinton did and George Mitchell did. We appreciate what the Friends of Ireland and on the Hill did. They stuck with us through all of the ways, and we were very grateful for that. The last point you could say about Northern Ireland conflicts and other conflicts, you have to try in any conflict, I think, to leave history behind. We're not that good at doing that in Ireland, but I think we've had a good year of it this time. George Mitchell used to always say that it's difficult to do that, but it's essential to try and do it. We've many centuries of conflict to draw on, as you know. And George used to say it was in inexhaustible locker. As soon as you get talking to an Irish person, particularly if they have one or more glasses of something or another, you know, you can be back in 1916 in a flash. And in two flashes, you're back in 1798. And then you're back in the Battle of Kinsale in 1740. And then it's the bloody Normans coming in 1169. And you know, we're really good at doing that. But you do have to try and leave a bit of the history beside. You can't. If you're to do that, would I be here with Gary, a Methodist leader of the Loyalist people, person I've great admiration for, where we work together with Loyalist people and, you know, bring the people in from conflict. And, you know, it's not easy. If we were to stay arguing about it, we'd never get to the end, because I'd believe I was right, he'd believe he was right, and you just go around the mulberry bush and we never get there. So you do have to try and leave that behind, and I think in our case we did that. A particularly important lesson from our process, in my view, is the need to find a way to secure validation of the outcome of the agreement. And I mentioned the vote, and I'm just not going to go back over that. But a further lesson is to put in place structures and institutions which will enable people to work together afterwards on practical issues. And this is where we are now, 2016. The practical issues have come to fruition, issues such as economic development, dealing with health issues, education, and all these issues. People north and south are working on all these issues now, and that's the great thing about it. It's not all of the bad things. And apart from being necessary in their own right for the development of society, the very fact of having to cooperate on practical issues makes an enormous difference. Reflecting back, ladies and gentlemen, I would suggest a huge store be placed in the process of implementation of any agreement reached in peace talks. And Good Friday was a critical moment for the closure of the past for us in Ireland, even if it took us a while to get there. In drawing to a close, I want to express that for me it was a deep honour to be part of what was a long process by a lot of politicians, a lot of people from Ireland, a lot of different Taoiseachs in different times to come to the end. But the thing that I always recall, and the point that I think never can be forgotten, is the sadder but abiding thought will be for the victims of the Troubles. Those people for whom the new beginning of the Good Friday Agreement came too late. Also for those that were named and injured, who will carry for the rest of their lives the scars, physical, mental, of the terrible time in our history. My deepest hope is that it will be a consolation for them, and hopefully that no family will have to go through that in the future. We can't offer them much more. You try to get justice, but it's very hard to deal with thousands of cases. I know there's individuals doing their best on that, but those people who are the victims of Troubles, when I look at the conflict in Syria now, 350,000 people dead, and God knows how many more will that figure when finally the war is over, and when they do a true terrible count of what it is. The refugees, all of the horror stories that lead out of that, all that happens in the Middle East today, happens in the continent of Africa, all of these, you know, senseless killings and that lead to bitterness. And I was asked today, earlier on, in Colombia, what after 52 years of conflict, where 500,000 people have died, how will the victims feel? How will they move on? And the simple answer is they won't. All as you can do is ask them to give it a fair wind, that they can move forward. You cannot ask people who've lost loved ones, whose wives or fathers went out for work and then were blown to pieces by one side or the other, or people that just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time and got shot, anywhere in the world. But we should always think of them. And I think whenever we're dealing with conflicts, and I think as we look back on the centenary we shouldn't forget all of those people who gave their life that someday we would make Ireland a better place. And as I said, it started my remarks today talking about the terrible times of the past. Now we've a peaceful Ireland, but that peaceful Ireland must never move on without remembering those who lost their life in the process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bertie, for those remarks. Our next speaker, Reverend Dr. Gary Mason, has dedicated his life to transforming and bringing together communities throughout Belfast and Northern Ireland. He is recognized as having played an integral role in the Northern Ireland peace process and is the founder and director of Rethinking Conflicts. He led the efforts to establish the Skanos Project, an urban redevelopment regeneration project in East Belfast, and believes the church can play an important role in engaging at its grassroots level to help build peace and transform fragmented communities. He is a research fellow at the Kennedy Institute for Conflict Intervention at Maynooth University in Ireland, and we are honored to welcome him here tonight to speak about his work and his experiences. Reverend Mason.
Can I begin by saying what an honour it is to be here tonight and to pay tribute to you, Vicky, for this astounding building in memory of your husband and a sterling work for peace and reconciliation on the island of Ireland. To also thank the Consul General in Boston. I work very closely, as you know, Fionnuala, with the Department of Foreign Affairs and have done for a number of years, and for the role, this very strategic role that they have played in building peace. And also to my relationship with my friends and colleagues from the Edward Kennedy Institute at Maynooth University, who, as I mentioned today, believe in academic rigour, but they also believe in practical engagement in the chaos of the world, which is crucial. The Easter Rising. Let me read you a little extract from a person called Colum, and he says this: in the early hours of Thursday of Easter week, in 1916, my grandfather came into the front bedroom of our small house in Enniscorthy. His sons woke and watched as he lifted some of the floorboards and removed a rifle. That's what his grandfather was doing in 1916. In 1916, my grandfather was almost killed as he fought for the British against the Turks at the Dardanelles. I remember as a small boy my grandfather taking me to church, and like most men, my grandfather was vain. He had a great mop of white hair, but it had a wound which almost killed him when a piece of shrapnel hit him. And he literally had a wound in his head that I guess was probably the depth of this little inkwell. And every Sunday morning at church, he used to put his head down to me and say, "Gary, is my wound covered?" And he had this great mop of white hair. And I used to say, "No, Granda, there's just a little bit of red I can see." And I would have kind of, as a 6-year-old boy, fixed that little piece of hair to make sure the wound was covered. That story of that British Unionist tradition shaped me as a person, as a human being. Last week I spent in Jerusalem having conversations with Israelis and Palestinians. And my good friend Zina Barakat, who's a Palestinian woman, gave me this little book entitled Israelis and Palestinians Contested Narratives. Like the unionist narrative or the nationalist narrative. And in it she writes this: narratives shape social knowledge. We remember what we experience and what our leaders, our parents and grandparents and teachers tell us. And she writes in The Search for God at Harvard, Ari Goldman relates the advice he received from his great Aunt Minnie. She said this, "Remember, she whispered into my ear at a family gathering before I left for Harvard and Cambridge, you can study all the religions, but Judaism is the best." And I'm sure all of us as individuals from other religions can recall stories where our parents or grandparents told us that ours was the best. James Joyce once commented that history is a nightmare from which I'm trying to awake. And I think very painfully in the island of Ireland, we are slowly waking up from some of the nightmares that Bertie has mentioned over the last 100 years. And then just for a few moments, I want to do a sort of seesaw mechanism about one view, the other view, but eventually paint the picture of how we're moving forward. Many people within that unionist tradition would have commented of the Easter Rising, was it really a revolution? And in The Socialist, a magazine written by those on the left, they said we should not let the legacy of the 1916 Easter Rising in Ireland be rewritten and repackaged by right-wing historians. And they pick out for special treatment Kevin Myers of the Irish Times, who viewed the Rising as unmandated violence against a constitutional government. One view plays against the other view. The whole debate around, was it a just war, was it not a just war? Again, Patsy McGarry, whom I know well, commented in the Irish Times that it was immoral and anti-democratic. And yet Noam Chomsky very rightly says as well that in the case of Ireland, he said, after all, it was England's longest held colony. Does it not seem simplistic to castigate the signatories as undemocratic for not pursuing the electoral route? The debate over civilians. Conversation often had by those within my tradition saying, well, let's be honest. The majority of people who died in Easter week were civilians. 60 rebels, 130 soldiers, and 300 civilians, including 40 children. But again, that's too simplistic. Because as we all know, most of the casualties in wars, already alluded there to Syria, the majority of casualties are civilians. So those within my tradition, within that Protestant unionist loyalist tradition, they say, well, there were 10,000 fighting in the trenches at the time of the rebellion. The very week of the Easter Rising, 570 of the 16th Irish Division were killed. You're stabbing in the back the men that are dying for you in the trenches, shouts Bessie Burgess at an IRB gunman in Sean O'Casey's play The Plough and the Stars. But yet again, the enigma of the formation of the Ulster Volunteer Force. Those who wanted to remain British declare war on the British and were saved there from a all-island civil war by the First World War. But I've often commented as a religious leader that we need to be very careful in any conflict about what I call toxic theology or toxic religion. That both the churches on the island of Ireland have used theology and used religion in a way that has fostered division. The phrases of blood and soil, a pure Irish race. Pearse's statement, blood sacrifice is a cleansing and sanctifying thing. Whose side was God on? Was it for God in Ireland or for God in Ulster? With this amazing ability to kind of bring God into our image. The American sociologist once said, God created man in his image and we've returned to favor. So we always have this ability to recreate God as definitely being on our side. Another debate there within the whole question of theology where one leading Irish Catholic theologian said, that Pierce's portrayal of the rebellion as a sacrifice might masquerade in Catholic devotional dress, but its meaning the master who it served was not a Christian God. The consequences of the rising, cherishing all the children of the nation equally. I suppose many within my community, and this has been an ongoing conversation, did we in 1916 understand each other? The answer is categorically no. We didn't. But today, one of the key components within Irish society is that principle of understanding. That was 1916. This is 2016. And I often remind folk that there are two haunted houses in Ireland. Not just nationalism, not just unionism. And I want to suggest that we all need exorcise from the blood-stained ghosts who would hold us to the past. We need to expunge those stereotypes and those mythologies that have dogged our understanding and take our cue today in 2016 from the spirit of peace, mutual understanding, and respect. I've often used the phrase the interdependence of our histories. We need each other. If we're going to shape a new Ireland and a new existence north and south, we need each other. And so I've often commented that the power of memory is crucial as we move forward. Bertie rightly alluded to the concept of dates. Bertie whipped in a few Catholic Republican dates there. Let me give you a few of mine. 1619, 1912, 1921, etc., etc., etc. They're tattooed on our skulls. I wrote an article a few years ago for an English newspaper. And I began with the line, as I drive the 1.2 miles to my office every day, the past screams at me from every gable wall. What they did to us, never what we did to them. So as we look to the future, I think we need to ask the question, how do we rebuild our painful, protracted, difficult history? Hubert Butler uses the phrase, the sores of Irish history. How do we heal the sores of Irish history? The French historian Le Goff comments very rightly. He says, we need to ensure that collective memory contributes to the liberation rather the enslavement of humankind. How does that look today? R.F. Foster, the historian, in a very interesting essay entitled Theme Parks and Histories, said he has some sympathy for the Northern Irish critic Longley's suggestion that the next commemoration of Irish history might take the form of raising a monument to amnesia and forgetting where we have put it. And as a historian, Foster comments, I have to say I was rather shocked by the idea. But as an Irishman, I'm rather attracted to it. I don't want my children to grow up with stories of what they did to us. I don't want a person in the Republic and nationalist side of stories what we did to them. We need to learn how to commemorate and learn from our past, not glorify some of the hell that both communities put each other through. And what we also need to do, I believe, is make many of the private conversations public. Let me give you an example. I have had senior Republicans in rooms with senior loyalists. One very senior Republican recently said in a private conversation to me and others, we inflicted awful pain on the unionist community. And a leading unionist politician who was in that room expressed sympathy to this leading Republican for the ills and mistakes of unionism. and the pain that they inflicted on nationalism. But the difficulty is, as you know, trying to make those private conversations public. And that's going to be one of the next significant moves as we deal with the legacy of the past. If you were to say to me today, what is the biggest issue facing us? It's the legacy of the past. And I've often said the past is meant to be learnt from, not lived in. We spend too much time looking back rather than looking forward. My good friend John Brewer, a professor at Queen's University, calls it the rear view mirror syndrome. And when you all leave this building tonight and get into your vehicles to drive home, try driving home only by looking in your rear view mirror. You know what's going to happen? Most of you are going to end up in the bay. You're finished. We spend too much time in Irish society looking in the rear view mirror. We need to learn to look forward, and if we give people a new future and a new beginning, they will begin to deal with the past. And just on a humorous note as I begin to pull this together, I remember one wet November night when I was based up on Springfield Road Methodist, beside those gates in Workman Avenue where a orange parade sometimes passed through and sometimes didn't pass through. I remember going to this church meeting, and this little kid, she was about like 15 or 16, a little Protestant girl, on the Protestant side of the fence as I was just about to go through to the Catholic side to a meeting. She says to me in a strong Belfast accent, she shouts, "Hey, Gary!" I says, "Yeah." She says, "I'm dating a wee boy from the other side." I says, "Oh, really?" She says. I turned to this kid and I said, well done. But as I walked through that fence, you know what I said to myself? Isn't it disgraceful that we have taken the most basic human emotion? So I'll do a poll here. Who in this room has been in love? Come on, don't be shy. You all have. You've all done the love thing. You've done the romance thing. But I said, isn't it disgraceful that we have taken the most basic human emotion, falling in love, and we've made it wrong? So that's what sectarianism does. Hear me in that. That's what racism does. That's what Islamophobia does. That's what anti-Semitism does. All those isms. They destroy the most basic human emotion of love. Let me conclude by quoting the Irish president. Michael Higgins, just before the pre-Easter commemoration, said this: "My great hope as head of state is that we will put ourselves into each other's history. We must be able to take your version, my version, move into the shoes of the other, and we must be open to changing our version as new facts, information, and analysis becomes available to us." I would hope that people in Northern Ireland will approach these commemorations, and as we commemorate the Battle of the Somme, that we will do so generously. There's a Christian word, I had to get it as a minister, called grace. We all need a little bit more grace, or if you're secularists here today, a little bit more generosity as we seek to understand the other. Leading Jewish theologian Abraham Joshua Heschel, who, as you know, walked tirelessly and faithfully with Martin Luther King Jr. Two of his quotations, with this I'll finish. He said, "Dehumanization precedes genocide." Dehumanization precedes genocide. As a loyalist paramilitary said to me, and if you'll excuse one swear word from a minister, but this could have come from either side, he said, "When you were taught Catholics were shit in Sunday school, it was much easier to kill them." The toxic role of religion on both sides We've done religion badly at times in the island of Ireland. But Abraham Joshua Hazel also said, it was words, not machines, that created Auschwitz. It was words, not machines, that created Auschwitz. So how we speak as people in this room is also crucial. The power of the verbal, the power of the word. So how I speak of people within the Catholic, nationalist, Republican tradition is important. How they speak of me as a human being is important. It was words, not machines, that created Auschwitz. So all of us in this building have that power to shape a new future. And I just pray by God's grace, I know we can do it, but we need to do it together.
Good evening. I'm Kevin Cullen from the Boston Globe. I'm going to ask Bertie Ahern and Dr. Mason to come back up, take seats here. They're going to be joined by Trace Murray, the former Senate President of Massachusetts, and Rob Savage, who is a professor of history at Boston College. A stellar panel, minus me, of course. It's the only time you find Bertie Ahern to the left of me. Rob, let me start with you. Bertie just gave, I think, a historical continuum of conflict in Ireland and ultimately resolution. Some wags referred to the Good Friday Agreement as Sunningdale for slow learners, basically saying that what we got in 1998 we could have got in the 70s. In that context, was the Easter Rising inevitable? Was there a way that it could not have happened? Would home rule eventually have happened if, as John Redmond described it, the war got over and the British government finally got around to doing it, or a little more complicated than that?
It's much more complicated than that, although it's been a question that's animated much discussion. I've been attending conferences and seminars in Ireland and the UK over the last year that have focused on questions like this. And one of the great things to hear is these sort of narrative exchanges that we've been talking about here, is at least a discussion about was 1916 necessary. I think it was inevitable myself, but again, these questions are being debated and today in a way that they hadn't been talked about in the past, and I think that's real significant progress. I mean, the difference between the celebrations of the 50th anniversary of the Rising in 1966 and the commemoration this year is just extraordinary. I think there's been sincere effort on both sides to engage one another, and the commemoration in Ireland has made an effort to reach out to engage with loyalism and unionism and to address the Battle of the Somme, for instance. So this commemoration has been much more inclusive, and the kind of questions you've asked, Kevin, have been debated and led to all sorts of arguments and speculation, but in a very constructive context.
Well, explain to us why it had to happen, why it was inevitable.
Why 1916 was inevitable? I suppose passions were so high. I think there were faults on both sides. I don't think the nationalists really understood how deeply committed Protestants in the North, but throughout Ireland, were committed to the Union, how much they felt part of Great Britain, and looked to London. And on the other side of the equation, many Unionists didn't understand how important it was for nationalists to have control over their own destiny, to have their own country, to embrace the Republican ideal and ideology that had been articulated by historical leaders going back to the time of Wolfe Tone and Robert Emmet and young Ireland and the Fenians of 1867. So again, this sort of narrative exchange was not happening. This sort of communication did not take place. Nationalists and Unionists were not speaking to each other. They were speaking to London, to the British, explaining what they wanted. But there was not the courage, the fortitude to engage one another. And that's changed. That's changed, especially with the Good Friday Agreement. I think in the future, historians will look back and look at John Hume as a very important character, somebody that was, in many respects, the architect of the Good Friday Agreement, but also look at the commitment people like Ahern made to trying to find a resolution. I remember that David Trimble, as well as Bertie and John Hume, all received honorary degrees from Boston College. And David Trimble once told the story that the peace process was at an impasse, that the Good Friday Agreement was getting close, but a draft arrived at Hillsborough Castle that he was upset with, that couldn't go forward. And Bertie Ahern at the time was at the funeral of his mother, at the graveside when he received a call. And he went from his mother's funeral up to Hillsborough Castle to hammer out an agreement to push this Good Friday Agreement forward. And that takes a lot of courage. That takes a commitment. And David Trimble always appreciated that and has gone on record to say that. Again, perhaps there wasn't the courage to engage in that type of exchange in 1916. It was an exciting period. The First World War was raging, and there wasn't the dialogue that there perhaps...
Well, Bertie mentioned that this conflict, the resolution ultimately was when it was internationalized, and you're not going to internationalize it back in the middle of the World War.
That's right.
First World War. It's just not going to happen.
Right.
Terry, let me ask you, Gary talked about the Irish propensity to dwell in the past as we aid them tonight. The idea that there's no future, just the past happening over and over again. When you started going over there, particularly when you went up north, did you get that sense? Did you, from both sides, either side, that there was just this overwhelming, that everybody kind of looked backward as opposed to forward?
Only in the very beginning, and I can honestly say it was a very short period of time because my first meeting there was with both Unionists and former IRA people, and they both gave us their sides of the story or the conflict. But we both came together on business right after that, with the Chamber of Commerce in Derry and with the Invest Northern Ireland in Belfast. And just talking the business and the economy of jobs and education, those things started falling away, and we started coming together more and more and more on what we can do. How could we? The gathering is a beautiful example of come back to Ireland and the tourism. You marketed the entire island of Ireland, not the north and not the south. It was all of Ireland. Come on home. And the beautiful videos that were done to do that, both in the north and the south, and the cross-border initiatives that have come as a result of the trade missions were brought over there. See Gino Flaherty here, and I know he's part of those also, along with Mayor Walsh. Every time we went, it just got easier and easier and better and better. And we have so many cross-border initiatives now, again, around business, the economy, and education, that history is starting to let go, and I think you're absolutely right. I know in my own family, growing up here, many generations, a few generations removed, it was hard to put that aside of what I've been told by my grandparents, parents. I mean, we were born with this from the beginning, and to think that you can let that go and good things can come out of that. And the barracks are gone, the barbed wire is gone in Derry. Where the barracks were is now an outdoor entertainment space. There's a peace bridge there. It's such a beautiful, welcoming, vibrant city.
So let me ask you, when you first arrived there as a public official, very prominent person, did you feel impartial Or did you feel?
Oh, no.
you felt more-
Martina Anderson gave me a dare. I was going to Belfast on a healthcare mission, with a trade mission, and to speak on a healthcare conference. And I had just met her with Stephen Tolman introduced me. And she said, he told me who this was. And she said, well, you've got to go to Derry. I said, I don't know if we have enough. And she said, well, they'll never let you go. I said, well, no one tells me where I can't go. So we went, and we met with open arms for both sides. Both sides, again, wanted to indoctrinate us on where they came from, and former prisoners, and the apprentice boys. We met with everybody. But we had a dinner. Martin McGuinness put a dinner together with all of us. It was the beginning of a great relationship.
Gary, let me ask you this about, I thought one of the most moving speeches during the 1916 commemorations, when I was over there, was President Higgins. And he talked and said it was appropriate that people were looking with some retrospection at the use of nationalist violence. But he said that what was lacking, he thought, was a similar retrospection and a revision, if you want, of the use of imperialist militarism and violence. Did that resonate in the unionist community at all?
Yeah. It was an excellent question, Kevin, because, I mean, I think having just returned, I mean, I'm in the Middle East often, as you know, and having just returned, there's no question the way imperial powers carved up the Middle East, people like Bertie and me are still dealing with that stuff today. So I think as regards violence, there's the violence of the state. No question about that. States can be violent. So it's not just those who are classed as freedom fighters. And I think there needs to be honest conversations around that. And I think when governments actually say, sorry, it is incredibly disarming. And I think globally governments, personally, need to be better, if you want to put it in an old-fashioned religious phrase, a little bit of healthy repentance from some of the mistakes that those involved in empires have done in the past would do us all a hell of a lot of good. So I think Michael was right in relation to that. And I think some of the conversations that are happening, I mean, there's no question about it. Northern Ireland, as Trimble has said, was a cold house for Catholics. Unionism, I mean, I'm quite happy to say as a religious leader, it was wrong. It was fundamentally wrong. Do I understand why it happened? Yes, I most certainly do. But it was still wrong. Because there was always the eye kept on the South. And the polemics of the Reformation were still alive and well. I mean, most of the world had moved on from the religious wars of Europe. We were verbally still playing these things out in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s when I was growing up as a kid. So you viewed the other side with suspicion. I think honesty is crucial as well. I remember addressing Sinn Féin and that holy grail of republicanism, the Rotunda rooms a few years ago when they were doing the Uniting Ireland conferences, and sort of Jerry Adams was in the front row and Pat Doherty, and I sort of did a little bit of healthy confession and told them about a song that my granda taught me as a wee boy that wasn't very nice to those on the other side. And then I sort of teased the Shinners and said, do you want to teach me any of your songs? Of course, none of them opened their mouths, but I'll not name the person, but a leading Republican came up to me later on and said, Gary, thanks for being so bloody honest. I could teach you a song or two myself. So we all, I think, just need that disarming honesty. You know, we've both gotten it wrong. The empires, the imperial powers have gotten it wrong. We've handled their differences in very wrong ways. I think as Bertie says, there's a template now to do things different. And I think we need to do that.
Bertie, in the run-up to this year, I think there was a lot of toing and froing and fraying, and some people were very worried, thought that the whole tone of celebrating something like 1916 was not right, that the commemoration was the better term. But from my perspective, and I wrote a piece in the Globe about this, is that it did come off without what you would call triumphalism. It did come off with an awful lot of sensitivity to the unionist side. I just walked through St. Stephen's Green 2 weeks ago, and there's a huge outdoor display about the Battle of the Somme. Do you think it came off? I mean, did you share any of those concerns? Were you worried about how this was going to play out?
Well,
I think the danger was that some of the relatives would start of the 1916 on the Republican nationalist side would feel that this wasn't a true commemoration of their event. And as you know, back through a lot of last year, there was a lot of that talk. But in the end, I think a lot of good handling, a lot of good effort involving people in the committee, involving historians, and I think government did a good job of pulling people together and acknowledging how we had to do this. And while you know, not everyone was going around happy, they were happy enough. But I think all of the main events were really, really well. And because they were taking place one week after the other, there were different ones. I took the view, because of my involvement, that I went to them all. And when you're sitting around, you don't have to speak anymore when you're not in office. It's good fun just seeing who was there one week and who wasn't the next week. I'd love to tell you, I'm not going to mention any names. I'd love to tell you there were a lot of people there some weeks that weren't there other weeks. So for me to say to you, no, it was all perfect, would not be true, because there were some people who didn't like it and didn't turn up to one event and then turned up to another. But overall, I think it went really well. Imagine if we had been trying to do this 10 or 20 years ago.
No, I don't.
It would have been an absolute nightmare.
I remember I was there for the 75th anniversary, and there was a small commemoration at the Garden of the Remembrance, and it was led by your old pal, Bobby Balla, the artist. And obviously, Bobby at the time said that it was being ignored, and this was obviously 1991, and troubles were still on, and was for political reasons it was being ignored. I saw Bobby not that long ago, right in the run-up to this, and he was really bothered by the fact that British soldiers who died in 1916 were being commemorated too. What was your take on that?
Well, I knew this because I'm very involved in Glasnevin Cemetery for a long time, in the Glasnevin Cemetery Trust. They had a series of events in the cemetery throughout the years for people who, you know, got their various British Army crosses and monuments. But you know, I was at those events, and there were huge amount of your people down to these events. Families come down, and they all went off, you know, very, very well. The only argument in the end was that all the names of the people that were killed was put on the one wall in Glasnevin, and that caused a bit of friction. But I think, in fairness, it was only a bit of friction. And it wasn't, but I think all of the events, the events itself, in the World War events, were well attended. There were you know, good collective cross the divide events. A lot of the commemorations, the you know, community events around the country, there were excellent cultural events. So I
Did
think
you personally have a problem with the British soldiers being on the? There's an equivalency with them and the children and the civilians and the volunteers killed?
No, I didn't. I didn't. Now, if you ask me the question, well, I know what the question is, because I've said this. If you ask me the question, how will I feel in 2 years' time or 3 years' time when they put up the black and tans names on the thing? That's going to be hard. God.
Would O'Casey call that going beyond the beyond?
Well, I don't know, but I'd have to walk around the bush a few times.
How about historically, Rob? Let me ask you that. I mean, obviously we know what the Black and Tans did. It's historical record, and these are people that would be hauled before the Hague if they did it today. Where would you put the British soldiers that responded to the Easter Rising in 1916? Is that a different kettle of fish?
Yeah, well, I think you'd have to draw the line somewhere, Kevin. That's what I'd argue. The conscripts that tried to or succeeded in putting down the rebellion in 1916 were young kids that were, you know, came out of England and Scotland and Wales, many from an Irish background. There were, you know, Irish soldiers who were wearing British uniforms that were killed during Easter week 1916. They're different than the black and tans who many would argue were mercenaries who engaged in some really horrific acts. I mean, there were horrific acts committed by all sides, but I can see the notion of being inclusive and including the British soldiers, the volunteers, the young kids that were 17, 18, 19 years old that were killed during Easter week. Those that were in the black and tans or the oxys, I'm not so sure of. I think that would create a good bit of discomfort. I can see where Bertie's going with that one.
Because I was talking in the context of 1916, it wouldn't have happened without Americans. There was so much American involvement, and from Tom Clark being here, from James Connolly lived on Mission Hill for a while, but he found out the labor movement here was not as strong as it was back home. Did you get that sense that when you were over there trying to make inroads and position yourself as an honest broker, along with other American politicians, was that history a hindrance? I mean, didn't Unionists see American intervention as almost always on the nationalist side, going right back to 1916?
I didn't get that feeling from most of them. I had a very interesting conversation with both Martin and Mr. Robinson, one-on-one, just the three of us. It was rather powerful. Coming out of that, I made a commitment to them that I would bring a certain amount of money and people if they would really lift the cap on McGee, or the Catholic kids go to school over there. We kept our part of that bargain. Mr. Robinson left just before that happened, and so as far as I know, that hasn't happened. Very disappointing, because we did make that agreement. I'm hoping at some point they lift that cap. I know it comes from London. It's part of the way that they put their education program together. It's not something we do here. So that is the only disappointment I found. I found just everybody wanted to work together. Everybody has a different goal today. I did get some comments from people in West Belfast that I hadn't been there and I should go to West Belfast. I haven't gotten there. Hope to do that, but I didn't have the time in the years I was president to go everywhere, and we've made such inroads, and Americans here, particularly in Massachusetts, have been so responsive and so generous in the American Ireland Fund, and there's in investing in the schools in particular, trying to integrate the schools, because it's probably going to do one more generation and maybe everything will get rid of that past and that history. Whether you were part of that history or not, or you were just told about that history and you live with it. So yeah, when I got there, I had some definite preconceived notions. In fact, my entire family said, "What are you going to the North for?" And now I tell them, and I bring them to the North, and I don't know why they didn't go, but it was because they thought that they wouldn't be welcome.
Harry, Bertie talked about the historical continuum here, and I was wondering, I was there when the Queen visited, and it was a remarkable, it was one of those moments where I felt I was really witnessing history. And we kind of know how it played in Ireland in general, and it was, played very well down south, but how did it play up north? How did the Queen's visit, I mean, were people upset that she basically said sorry and we should get along better and blah, blah? Well, how did it play up there?
Yeah. There's a high respect there for the monarchy within that British Protestant Unionist loyalist tradition. And on a personal note, I think she did the right thing. I think the key to all this, as I said earlier, Kevin, is the power of apology and the power of forgiveness. I mean, both sides in this conflict, we did awful things to one another. And I think there's a route now through this with a bit of wisdom and good leadership. But there was no one I heard within my tradition saying, "Isn't it awful the Queen did that?" I mean, she was acknowledging the pain, the raw emotion. And I've often said, I was just chatting with Rob earlier on about this. Sometimes confusion and complexity can be the friends of peace, because we've made our conflict too black and white. There's just one narrative is here and the other narrative is there. I think the more I look at those narratives, the more complex, the more confusing they are. I don't think that's a bad thing. And I think we just need to learn to live at times with that tension. A very senior, IRA leader said to me recently in a conversation, because I'm still, this Saturday, when I go back to Belfast, I'm spending the day facilitating a conversation with younger folk who have never met ex-IRA or ex-UVF, letting them know why those people made choices. Billy Mitchell, quick story, senior UVF figure, said quite right, in the late 1960s, someone did not fly over Northern Ireland and spray us all with lunatic gas and we all started killing each other. There was a context. There was a messy context. Northern Ireland was a sectarian cockpit. 80% of people that went to prison, if they had been born in Boston, London, Glasgow or Paris, would not have been in prison. So there was a context that made normal people do awful things. Just that complexity. And I think we need to drill down. And I'm quite happy to say, before an audience of primarily Irish Americans, there was a quite simplistic attitude around some Irish Americans in the 1970s as well. That has evolved into more mature thinking also, seeing that complexity and that confusion. And I think the more we engage with each other, the more we begin to understand each other.
Rudy, I know you're a great GAA man, and part of I'd say maybe one of the most controversial part of the Queen's visit was the idea that she would go to Croke Park and that she would commemorate Bloody Sunday in 1920 when people were killed by British forces there. First of all, when you're at Fagan's talking to guys, did that come up? And how did you personally feel about that?
Oh, I thought the whole visit was terrific, because it was the way back. The planning for the visit started way back. I have the original papers. I kept them. I'm going to keep them. Of what happened with the letters back and fro. And what happened was she was very anxious to come. Very, very anxious. And she said many, many times that she'd been everywhere in the world umpteen times, and the shortest distance across the water she had never been. And okay, some of the family were there, and even after Mountbatten, I think she thought it would never happen in her lifetime for very good reasons. And what President Mary McAleese was equally anxious, and we had said that, listen, we have to get policing fully done, and you remember all the problems about the policing. We said we have to get the policing done, because we can't get this across the line if the policing was, and the Queen's view was, well, that's the politicians, go work that out. But when it came to the visit, we had suggested that the way to do this was every other leader that comes to Dublin, they go plant a tree in Orsanouteron, and they go to the Garden of Remembrance. And it was our view that if she went to the Garden of Remembrance very early on in the visit, that would change the whole dynamic. Now, we didn't tell her what to say, because that was, but it was, she went further than we had thought. And she came back in under 48 hours, and it was made very clear to me the message was from her. It wasn't from her secretariat. This was back now 6 years before the visit. Came back that she had no difficulty with that. She would go to the Garden of Remembrance, and she understood, and what the wording is, because I have it, she understood the significance of doing that. She had no problem doing whatever. So I think she was, from that period, she was up to doing. But in fairness, it wasn't her delay or Mary McAleese. It was us trying to get all the other bits and all the other things that happened. But she was very anxious to come. And then how she played. The only thing that was sad in the end, the only thing that was I think that was I was upset about, and that we didn't have it a bit more open. But everyone was afraid that there could be huge protests, and that maybe this could go wrong. And I understood that, but it would have been, we could have had it more open. I mean, literally there was
Security was very intense.
yeah, the security. And when she went to Cork afterwards,
She was walking around the market.
yeah, and it got easier up. But I think she did everything. She did everything perfect on the visit. The visit was hugely symbolic, and I think she was. She doesn't cry easy. I'm told. But she at the it was a concert hall, wasn't it? It was a concert hall where they had the big thing at the end. After she came off the stage with Mary McAleese in the concert hall. I mean, I wasn't there, but she was visibly setting up, and she'd met all the different groups and young groups and people, and great atmospheres, terrific atmosphere, and like it was 100%. And some of the family have been over several times since, and there's never any difficulty. So it's a huge. But it's the same. I just as if there's a lot of people here who are back and forward to Ireland, and we're always grateful that people are from Irish Americans come to Ireland so much. I mean, there's 4,000 people a day, 5,000 people a day going through Dublin Airport one way. I mean, it's terrific, and it's much appreciated. But it's like the amount of interaction now between Dublin and Belfast is enormous. The amount of business people. Peter was head of the trade unions for the whole island of Ireland. The cultural groups, football, sport. I mean, there's very little. So it's amazing, and it's step by step. And I think that's that just has to keep going slowly. And if we keep doing that slowly, it'll help. You didn't ask me, but I just want to say I think the concept of having a border poll in the short term is a disaster.
Yeah.
I'm entirely opposed to it. There will be a day, someday, but I want to wait till I'm sure that Gary will vote the same way as me.
Yeah. Well, as I open up to questions in the audience, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask for a prediction on the replay on Saturday.
Well, we've no chance. We just turn up to these games, and
so you're betting heavily on Mayo?
I don't bet this, but we do turn up. I mean, you can be assured that come 5 o'clock, Dublin will turn up. But I mean, Mayo, they should have shown respect to that funeral back in 1951.
Okay. Yeah, tell that to the Chicago Cubs too. Well, do we have a microphone out in the audience? There we go. So. I don't know how much time we have for questions, but what's that? Up there? Okay. So anybody with questions, put your hands up and we'll try to recognize you. Hello? Goodness. No questions. Oh, right here, sir. Mr. Brown. And he's not Mrs. Brown's son. I just want to make that up.
One question. First of all, congratulations, Taoiseach and Gary, for your extraordinary work over the years in achieving the peace in North of Ireland. Question is, and we're looking at the title of today's discussion, it's 100 Years of Freedom, Ireland then and Ireland now. There's been many commentators talk of the Ireland now versus the Ireland of 1916. Can I ask both of you if you'd comment on how you see the island of Ireland and the society in Ireland in another 100 years?
So that's something categorically. I mean, I think they're within. The principle of consent obviously was crucial for unionism. There was no doubt about that. I mean, a meeting with the leadership of the UVF, there was 4 words they always wanted to hear: the union is safe. And that's really what allowed them to move forward. But if the time comes when there is a border poll or whatever, and it comes about democratically, I think unionism will accept it. I suppose there's always the worry, will there end up another guerrilla type of group? I don't think so. I think there's a maturity there now within unionism that if that's the route it goes down, that's what happens. And the last thing we want is to pass this pain to another generation. It's a changing place. I mean, I mentioned this morning, when I was a kid in the 70s, you know, my mummy and daddy didn't let me go into the city centre. Completely out of bounds. So you were confined to your own area of East Belfast. It's almost you were ghettoised in that sense. My kids now are in and out of the city centre, and they're mixing continually with the other side. And as I said kind of jokingly today, the more cross-community romances there are, the better. That'll add a little bit of confusion in relation to all that. And maybe the churches, with some of their dogmatism, need to be supporting those things as well. That we humanise the other person. That's what we need.
I think, you know, the only way, it was my call to move Articles 2 and 3 and put in consent, because I knew, you know, that was the only way we could settle the constitutional issue of the North. But as I said then, I say now, I mean, I am a United Ireland person. I mean, I want to see United Ireland. I don't think it's going to happen in the very short term. But the only way it'll happen is by people from the nationalist Republican tradition working with the people from the unionist loyalist tradition, working on every kind of project that's conceivable, trying to convince them and persuade them. And I think, you know, the day will come where they'll realise they'll get far better arrangement and be taught far more of in all island context. Of course, that can't just be them joining us. It has to be a new dispensation, new arrangement. But that can happen. I mean, they will realise that Westminster have too many other items on their agenda, and that their 1 hour visits a few times a year is just a sham. But that has to be done by persuasion, convincing. Anything that is intimidatory, and that's why I'm not against the border poll. Anything that forces them into their face is a retrograde step, and it would work against what true believers in the United Irish believe in. It might help short-termism for the next opinion poll or the next election, but in terms of winning the support and convincing people. And you know, I find when I meet loyalists and unionists, more and more I have things in common with them. I mean, they are more and more than privately watching Gaelic games. They're coming to Grove Park. Okay, it's still a bit on the radar. You know, they're coming down to Dublin for weekends. Dublin people are going up. You know, all of that's moving on, but it has to be done incrementally in its own time. Somebody blasting it down a megaphone at them is the wrong thing to do.
Questions? Oh, over here.
Hi, thank you guys so much. I want to hear more about the process of transformational leadership and transitional justice that has enabled the peace process to succeed at the level it has in Northern Ireland. And I'd also like to hear a reflection if there's something we in the United States can learn to improve our response to prisoner reentry and inner city violence based on your experience with ex-combatants.
But I'll let Gary talk about the prisons because he's done a huge amount of excellent work in that area. But, I mean, the Good Friday Agreement, as I said earlier on, I mean, it changed the entire criminal justice system, the whole police system. I mean, so much of what were the institutions were really totally changed. And that wasn't, to say everything that used to happen in the past was wrong. But I think there were fears and there were concerns that there were too many one-sided versions of things. So it was a whole new system. But the reality now is everybody respects the police force. I mean, you'll hear the Republican leaders calling on people to cooperate with the police, even when some of the issues mightn't suit them to do it, but they're doing it. So I think that whole police and criminal justice model right now, I wouldn't dare say we can teach anything to the United States from that, because like we were coming from a very different landscape. But I do think the policing, the reform of the policing thing, which was a sore issue for unionists and loyalist people, has worked very well. And the policing boards with political involvement, it's worked well. Are all these things perfect? Nothing is perfect, but I think they've worked really well. But the prisoners, I think, is a great story, and Gary is a better expert on that.
I think, again, I mean, just saying, about the Good Friday Agreement, I still think at times all of us, both within the island of Ireland and Europe and the United States, actually underestimate the achievement that was. I mentioned today about that very evocative title of Jonathan Powell. The catchphrase was, the hatred, the historical hatred that was there was pretty phenomenal at times, and there was little room for negotiation. So, I mean, what Bertie and Tony did, as Eamon Malley said, was a political miracle. I mean, the Good Friday Agreement, and you need to hear this clearly tonight, actually was a political miracle in getting people over the line. The transformational leadership, Lisa, is crucial. Absolutely crucial. This would not have happened without strong, transformative leaders like Bertie and Tony taking risks and not constantly looking over their shoulder at other people. And that happened across the island. There was a strategic group of people, both politically and religiously, were willing to take risks. And at times it wasn't easy. I mean, quick personal story. I mean, I know the date the IRA broke their ceasefire, 9th of February. It was my birthday. I was out for a meal. And 2 weeks later, I'd organised for 100 Methodist church folk to meet senior figures within Sinn Féin. And what did the provost do? Bomb London. 2 weeks before my meeting. I come under intense, and I mean intense pressure from church people, from other people. Don't you dare go ahead with this meeting. I did. And I gave people one phrase. I said, I know in that room there will be aggression, there will be loud conversations. But let me assure you of this, those conversations will not be as loud and as damaging as bombs going off in Canary Wharf. So painful as it was, it needed to happen. Thankfully, Republicanism re-engaged, put their ceasefire back in, but it has to be about taking risks. Too many clergy, and I say this unashamedly, we have ended up chaplains to our own tribe. And that is fundamentally wrong. Be it in the Middle East, be it anywhere at all, we need to engage with the other and understand the other.
Gary's point is a very good one that I think we should remember, that the Good Friday Agreement or the Belfast Agreement was miraculous, and it has been inspirational. I was listening to an interview on the way driving my son to school this morning, and NPR, a correspondent was interviewing the president of Colombia, asking the president, well, this conflict has gone on for over 50 years. It's cost, tens of thousands of lives. Why did you think you could succeed? And he mentioned the Good Friday Agreement. He said he was inspired by what happened in Belfast when leaders from Sinn Féin and from the loyalist parties could sit down with the encouragement of London and Dublin and hammer out an agreement. It is something that's inspired other people. And this war in Colombia dragged on for decades and decades. And to see FARC, the terrorist group, or the sort of guerrillas sit down with the government is a major achievement. And to hear, the president reference the Good Friday Agreement was extraordinary.
I think we have time for one more question. Right here. You're lucky.
that changed? Thank you. Has that changed since the Good Friday Agreement, and what changes do you think need to be implemented, and how this history is taught to the next generation to keep this progress moving forward?
I think in just talk for the other side, I don't think there's any reason not to teach the history of the period. I'd be afraid that people would be reluctant to do that. I think they should do it. But the difference is, like we were talking earlier on about the difference between the 75th anniversary and the 50th anniversary and now the 100th anniversary, that you're able to have the Battle of the Somme or any of the other battles that have gone on, Gallipoli or any of them this year, and they've been well attended. Ministers have been there, and there's been no hoo-ha, few lunatics. But by and large, it's without any difficulty, and I think that's so. The history should be taught, but it should be taught in a balanced way. I mean, let's be honest, some of these things were not very balanced. I was taught in school that all those unions came in were planters, and they stole our land. So I grew up thinking the best way of solving the problem was just to get them to leave again. And but anyway, that wasn't going to work, so we found a different way. So I think you have to teach the history but it should not be dodged, because that's a different problem. Because if you dodge teaching it, there are others that fill the vacuum, and they start giving their version of what happened. So I think once it's done in a balanced way. I mean, there are some historians, and again I'll mention no names, and who are now given versions of not just 1916, but let's, without being controversial, let's give it on the 1913 workers' strike. And I can't find any book in the world that gives versions of some of these stories. I mean, they obviously were there 100 years ago. And they give a version that nobody else has given. And they call themselves modern-day historians. Now, I'm definitely afraid of revisionists far more than I'm afraid of anybody else.
I mean, as a kid, did I learn Irish history? No. I could tell you about the Crimea War and Bismarck and the Charge of the Light Brigade. You weren't taught it. Now, kids in school are taught it. And just I think that knowledge and understanding is key. And again, I still come back also to the whole concept of, I mean, our conflict was never a religious war in that sense. But I would say strongly and unashamedly as a clergy person that what I call toxic religion fed into that. I mean, Jonathan Sacks, the well-known chief rabbi, just retired of the British Commonwealth, has this wonderful phrase where he says, religion is like fire. It warms, but it also burns. And we are the guardians of that flame. So no matter what your faith background is tonight, are you a warming person or a burning person? I mean, religion is power, and anything that is power can be used, misused, and abused. So we're the guardians of that flame. I want to be a person that warms, not a person that sears and burns. And I just think it's key that we foster that whole concept.
Well, in Dublin, football's religion, and I see a great Dublin footballer, Desi Farrell, over there. And Desi's the head of the Gaelic Players Association, and if I asked him what he thinks is going to happen on Saturday at the replay, I would be accused by a Mayo man in looking for equal time. And if I give a Mayo man equal time, we'll never get out of here. So I'm going to end it right there and ask Peter Castles, the executive director of the Kennedy Institute at Maynooth, to close our evening. Are there any Mayo?
Okay, thank you very much, Kevin. It's my great privilege on behalf of all of you to move a vote of thanks to our speakers and to our panel. And as we move that vote of thanks, I think we should reflect for a moment on who we're here to remember, the great man, the Senator Ted Kennedy. And as the evening was happening, I kept thinking, well, what would he have made of all of this? First of all, I think secretly he would be pleased that the Irish government decided to set up an institute in Ireland in his memory. It was set up obviously to remember and to reflect on his great contribution to the Northern Ireland peace process, which we've been discussing. But also, it's very clear in the terms of reference when they were establishing, they also said it was because of his commitment to economic and social justice. And as I watched the debate last night and see what's happening in the world, I think we could certainly do with more of Ted Kennedy's commitment to economic and social justice. I therefore also want in that context to personally thank Vicky for giving us the privilege of establishing the Institute in Ireland. And I want to thank her and James and the staff here at the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the Senate for hosting this evening. I think he would have enjoyed the discussion and the debate, and in particular our speakers on our panel. In particular, the fact that somebody like Bertie Ahern, as a former Prime Minister, would agree to become an adjunct professor at an Edward M. Kennedy Institute. I think he would have seen as a great honour. But equally, that somebody like Dr. Gary Mason, from again totally different tradition, would agree to become a senior research fellow at the Institute. And we have that great privilege every month and every day of having these two men there working in the Institute, and I think Ted Kennedy would have loved that. Equally, of course, he would have probably seen Teresa and Bob by now as one of his own and one of your own, and to see the great contribution that they've made in the discussion. But equally, Kevin, I think he would have looked at your moderating of the evening and said, why can't we have him now moderate the next debate between Trump and Hillary Clinton? We might get a lot more activity out of it. And finally, I think he would be pleased that the Irish consulate is in such capable hands as with Fionnuala. It was Fionnuala's idea that we should do the evening in this way rather than just a traditional 1916 event, and that we should have the two traditions in play. And she worked very hard with Dr. Kieran Doyle in trying to bring that about. And I think that has worked in the way that the evening has evolved, of having both traditions discuss and debate what the issues are. So finally, in thanking you all, and thanking you as an audience for coming here this evening, you are now in the traditional Irish way going to have a reception and some Irish music. And of course, you want to let your hair down and enjoy the evening. But I want you now, on everyone's behalf, to give, in the traditional way, a round of applause to our speakers and panel for the great evening we've had.